I did my graduate work at Trinity in Chicago. And while in Chicago, at Trinity, I took a course on Hebrews one fall semester. This was in 2009 with a guy named Peter T. O'Brien. Does that name mean anything to anybody? P.T. O'Brien? He's written a lot. In fact, after that semester, taking Hebrews with him, he went on to write a commentary on Hebrews, which, if you know anything about it, I still think it's a great commentary to use, okay? Full of biblical theological insight. So it was during that semester with Peter T. O'Brien and my classmates that I fell in love with the letter to the Hebrews. And at first, I was drawn in because, as you know, Hebrews is like one of the best examples we've got of how an early Christian author, an associate of an apostle, puts the Bible together, does biblical theology. I dare you to find a better place in the New Testament of somebody who's teaching us how do these testaments fit together. Hebrews just captured my attention because it's really good at teaching us that. But even more so, as I kind of got into Hebrews and worked on my dissertation in Hebrews, what drew me into Hebrews even more was, I think, Hebrews is one of the best examples we've got in the New Testament of a pastor pastoring. Yeah, he's really good at biblical theology, but here is a great example of a pastor doing pastoral work. So his church has an existential crisis, and they are threatening to abandon Jesus, and this pastor doesn't give them some trite, hey, just love Jesus more kind of email back to them. He gives them a fresh, biblical, theological portrait of Jesus Christ. He says things about Jesus in Hebrews that we don't find anywhere else in the New Testament. Nowhere else in the New Testament is Jesus explicitly called a priest. Hebrews does that. Here's an example of a pastor meeting the needs of his congregation with fresh biblical theological insight. That captured my attention. As I was on a pathway towards pastoral ministry, I said, I want to do that kind of pastoring. I want to mine the treasures of the Bible so that when my people say, Pastor, what about this? Or we're worried about that, or I don't know how to respond, I would have treasures old and new to bring to bear on their problems. And I think Hebrews models that extraordinarily, which is why I called, it's a mouthful of a title, and maybe I'd revise it a little bit now, but this whole series is Memoirs of an Extraordinary Pastor. Maybe you saw this on the invite. Hebrews and the Promise of Biblical Theology. So I do think Hebrews is an extraordinary pastor, and I want to commend his pastoral example to us. That's what I want to do. So I took that class at TEDS. I went on to write my dissertation and then publish my first book, which was on Hebrews. You can buy it on Amazon, but catch this, okay? If you're going to buy it, this is a big deal right here. Don't buy the hardback because it's $120. $100 Seattle Seahawks guy could buy it, but he'd need 20 more bucks, okay? Buy the paperback, it's $30. So I get 2.5% of that, so it's not like I'm asking for a lot of royalties here. So, all right, so I want us to look at Hebrews. That's our plan. I kind of gave you a sense of why Hebrews is dear to me. Let me kind of sketch out where we're going to go over these 4 talks, okay? So here's our plan. It's a little ambitious, but if you're a pastor, this is what we do every Sunday. We go up to the pulpit with 20 ideas, and we come back to our wives having said 2 of them, okay? So I taught Hebrews last semester to the seminary boys up at Bethlehem, and I taught it over 48 hours. 4 hours a week for, 12 weeks? Is my math right? Okay. All right. Well, I was looking at Shrug Man right there. He wasn't going to help me. All right. I taught it for about 48 hours to the seminary boys. I don't have 48 hours. I got 3. And I've already spent 5% clearing my throat doing prolegomena. So tonight, I want us to focus on Hebrews at a glance. I want to give you an idea of the book as a whole. That's what's on the top of your notes, I hope. Hebrews at a glance. And then tomorrow, in our first 2 sessions, we'll look at the stories Hebrews tells. Hebrews, its message, tells the same story 2 times. It's the same story. That's the structure of Hebrews, and then it applies that message. We're going to talk about both of those stories that Hebrews tells tomorrow morning, and then we'll finish taking a step back from what Hebrews says and looking at how Hebrews says what it says. I think we can learn how to pastor better from looking at Hebrews' example. I'll make a case for that tomorrow. If you think that kind of sounds strange, is Hebrews meant to teach us how to pastor? I'm going to say yes, and I'll hopefully make a case that will be at least sufficiently convincing to you, okay? So before you go, trust me, it will come here before you know it. Before you go tomorrow afternoon, I want you, this is my goal, my aim, my desire, I want you to feel at home with Hebrews. This is my picture. I think of Hebrews like a suitcase, and I want you to be able to grab the handle and pick that thing up and take it with you. You know what I mean by that? I want you to feel like I know what this book is about. I know what the pastor is trying to do. I know what all the parts are doing and what they're contributing. That's my goal. I want you to feel like at home with Hebrews. But second, I want you to feel inspired. Those of you, how many of you are pastors in the room? Come on, raise them up a little bit more, pastors. I know you're tired. It's a busy day for you today. I want you to feel, everybody else is included here too, but pastors especially, I want you to feel inspired by this model of pastoral ministry that we see. So that's what we're going to do. We'll talk about what Hebrews says, and then we'll talk about how Hebrews says what it says. So I'm going to do my best. You guys buckle in, prayerfully attend to the word. In fact, let's pause here and pray and ask God to help us. So God, would you help us? I am so excited to teach this amazing letter. Help us to lock in. We got a lot of things on our minds. We don't come here unencumbered by other concerns. But I think we'll do our best hearing and attending to your word if you would allow us to focus for these 4 sessions. That will be an act of grace, an act of generosity on your part. We ask you to do that. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, here's what I want to do tonight. I want to answer 2 questions. They're in your notes. 2 questions in this first session. First, what's the problem that Hebrews addresses? So that's what we're going to do. The first thing we'll look at, what's the problem that Hebrews addresses? That's the first step we'll take. The first question we'll answer. What is it that called forth this Christian pastor's response that we've got? That's the first one. Second question, problem. What do problems have with them? What happens to a problem? You do what to it, guys? We solve problems. Ladies too, all right? That wasn't meant to be misogynistic. The solution. What's the solution to the problem that Hebrews gives us? Why did Hebrews write what he wrote? That's the first question. And what did Hebrews write? So, all right, let's look at that first question. What's the problem that Hebrews addresses? So, you know this. Every New Testament letter is written for a reason. We call them occasional documents. They're written on occasion. Something calls them forth. Why was Hebrews written? What was it that motivated this pastor who, if you know Hebrews, was distanced from his congregation? What motivated him to write to his congregation? Why did he do it? I'm going to tell you this, and I think you agree with it. This is a question we have to ask every time we're interpreting a text. You're not done when you simply tell people what the text is saying. Your job is complete when you've answered the question, why? Why is this text saying what it says right now? I think we skip that part. We can summarize a text, but we don't take a step back and say, why is this text saying that thing right now? And when you can answer that question, you're then ready to use the text in the way that the author was using it in his letter. You're able to operationalize it in the way that he was. So I want us to answer this question. Every text is trying to do something. The guy who taught me preaching, a guy named Mike Bullmore, would say this: every text has a claim, has an intentionality, and our job is to find it. So we ask, what's the intention of Hebrews? What is it trying to do? So I'm going to answer the question with a big old statement, and then I'm just going to walk through and prove it to you. Here's the statement. It's in your notes. Here it is. What's Hebrews trying to do? Hebrews intends to help Christians tempted to abandon their Christian confession because of doubts about Jesus, and these doubts were exacerbated by suffering. That's what Hebrews is after. It's a letter intended to help Christians threatening to abandon their Christian confession. Well, why? Well, they had doubts about Jesus, okay? And those doubts were made worse, were made more weighty because the community was also suffering persecution. That's why Hebrews was written. That's what Hebrews is trying to do. It's trying to help people like that. So let's look at each part of that sentence. You say, prove it. I'll say, okay, let me try. So first, Hebrews intends to help Christians tempted to abandon their Christian confession. Let's talk about that briefly. We see this point that I just made, we see this primarily in the exhortations, the commands, the pastoral admonitions that Hebrews gives us. In fact, these are hard to miss. It's right on the surface of the text. In fact, we see it most clearly in the two places in Hebrews that summarize the pastor's message. There's two summary statements in Hebrews. They're almost identical, and both of them completely summarize the message of Hebrews. Hebrews 4:14 and Hebrews 10:23. It's actually Hebrews 4:14 to 16 and 10:19 to 25. But listen to these two verses. They're right there in your notes. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, notice what he says. Because of what I just told you, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. He's trying to get these Christians not to abandon their confession. Hold firmly to it. Then 10:23. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. He urges the community, don't let go of Jesus. Don't let go of that Christian confession. Now, we also find this grounded in the first exhortation that Hebrews gives us. Hebrews' first exhortation, it's there in your notes, Hebrews 2:1 through 4. Listen to how the author encourages his audience. He says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard. Why? So that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? Do you see what the author is doing here? He's saying you've got to hold on to something. He's got a group of Christians threatening to abandon their Christian confession. He says, don't do that. Don't neglect it. Don't ignore it. Hold unswervingly to it. We see it in a number of other places as well. I think I gave you a few in your notes. So, Hebrews is written to forestall just this sort of apostasy, this sort of ex-evangelicalism, this kind of deconstruction of the Christian faith, this abandonment of Christianity. That's why the letter was written. It wants to stop people from letting go. They're holding on to Jesus and they let go. It wants to stop people from doing that. So back to our summary. Hebrews intends to help Christians tempted to abandon their Christian confession. I sort of prove that. Now listen, it goes on, and specifically those tempted to abandon their Christian confession because of doubts about Jesus. If the apostasy that the community was threatening, if it was on the surface of the author's pastoral admonitions, if we look through the letter and we see it in the exhortations, we see these doubts about Jesus implied in the author's expositional sections of Hebrews and his doctrinal sections. every time the author of Hebrews appeals to the Old Testament, which, does he do that a lot? Yeah, okay, like all over the place. Every time he appeals to the Old Testament, or just about every time, he's trying to show his friends that what he's saying about Jesus was anticipated in the Bible all along. That's a very important point. When he appeals to the Old Testament, he's trying to say, see? Do you see? I'm not making this up. It was there all along if you just would have read it. If you just had ears to hear. You're tempted to doubt something. Don't think it's just me saying this. Samuel and the prophets and the Psalms and everywhere in the Old Testament already said the thing I'm saying. When the author appeals to the Old Testament, he's appealing to it to show them that what he says about Jesus was already in the Bible. So let me give you an example. This is Hebrews 5, 5, and 6. The author at one point, and we'll see this tomorrow, he wants to prove that it's good and right and biblical to call Jesus a priest. It would be kind of strange for you to call the king David a priest, wouldn't it? Priests, they don't come from the line of Judah, do they? No. So if you're going to have the audacity, author of Hebrews, let's just pretend we're the audience. If you're going to have the audacity to tell us that Jesus is a priest, you better have some proof for that. So he says, okay, Jesus is a priest. Let me show you Hebrews 5, 5, and 6. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, this is Psalm 2, 7, you are my son. Today I have become your father. And, catch this, he says in another place, you, Messiah, are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Where's that from? Is that from the Bible? What psalm is that from? Psalm 110, verse 4. There you go. We're going to talk about that psalm a lot. He says, it's okay for me to call Messiah a priest because God did it all the way back in the Psalms. He proves that Jesus is indeed a priest, that it's not it's not unexpected that he had called Jesus a priest because Psalm 110 says the Messiah would be a priest. So these proofs about who Jesus is from the Old Testament are found throughout Hebrews. Because they're designed, this is my point, they're designed to answer doubts that the audience have. Pastor Hebrews, we're struggling to understand this idea that you said Jesus is, and their big issue was, and we'll see, that you say the Messiah was a dying Messiah. That's a hard thing for us to get our mind around. How can you say that? They had doubts about Jesus, and he says, I hear your doubts, and I'm going to answer them by looking at the Old Testament. So, the audience, it's threatening to abandon their confession, it's threatening to let go of Jesus because they had doubts about Jesus, but also, I went on, these doubts were exacerbated by something. You may have doubts that you can live with, that you go on, kind of shrug on with for a little while, but I tell you what, when you get put under pressure, those doubts sort of take on a new kind of quality, don't they? Especially in my mind, if those doubts are related to, boy, maybe we could avoid the kind of pressure we're under if we just give up on Jesus and on this Christian community. So these doubts that the audience have were exacerbated by suffering. We see this everywhere in Hebrews. And in some cases, this suffering took the form of persecution. Notice what we've got there in the notes, Hebrews 6:10. The author says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. All right, he sees what you're doing. He sees the people who you're serving. Notice 13:3. Continue to remember those in prison, ostensibly some of those they were helping in chapter 6. Continue to remember them as if You were together with them in prison. You know what happens when you help somebody who's in prison for something? You run the risk of what? Of this happening to you too. Wait, you're associated with this guy? It's like Peter at night in the entrance to the high priest. Wait, aren't you one of the Galilean followers? Peter says, oh, that's not me. Right? If you identify with the guy in trouble, you may be in trouble as well. So these doubts that the community had were exacerbated. They were going through a season of suffering. And in fact, as we read on in Hebrews, we recognize that this season of suffering was probably heightened in its difficulty because it recalled a season of suffering the audience had experienced not too long in the past. They had been through something really hard already, had come through it, probably still catching their breath. And now are you telling me again we're going to suffer? Look at what he says in Hebrews 10:32. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light. The author is telling this. You endured a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourself had better and lasting possessions. The audience was going through a tough season. And you know what? They'd already been through a tough season. Again, learning the same lessons of suffering for their Christian faith. And they were tempted during this second round of suffering to say, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe we need to rethink these confessions we're making about Jesus. It sure would make our lives a lot easier. In fact, I think the place that points out that the community was suffering and on the cusp of suffering, I think the place that points this out the clearest is that chapter in Hebrews we all know, Hebrews 11. We sang about it tonight. That wonderful sort of hall of faith. Now, as you read Hebrews 11, more often than not, the heroes of faith are on the receiving rather than the giving end of a sword, if you know what I'm talking about. Aren't they? And this is why for prosperity gospel it just doesn't make sense, right? If you just had enough faith, you would conquer lions and all of that, and you say, what was wrong with the people in Hebrews chapter 11? They seem to have a lot of faith, and they still died by the sword. They were on the receiving end more often than the giving end of the sword, and I think Hebrews tells Israel's story in that way, highlighting the Abels, the Abrahams, the Moseses, the Gideons, and so forth. He highlights these sufferers more than he highlights those who triumphed, because he's saying there is a long line of people who have persevered during really tough times. I'm going to tell you this guy and this person and that person. I'm going to show them to you so you know it's possible to persevere in faith even in the midst of suffering. Hebrews 11 tells us, we infer from it, the author has calibrated, has coordinated his picture of Israel's story to tell his own community, you can persevere during suffering. Which we take away saying, man, this community was in a season of tremendous opposition. They were in a season of affliction. They were in a season of trouble. And the author is trying to tell them, don't let go of Jesus. Don't let those doubts about Jesus metastasize into full-grown apostasy. Don't do it. Hold on to Jesus. So, you say, what's the problem that Hebrews addresses? It's right there. That's the problem. Hebrews, this is the problem, intends to help Christians, people who claim to follow Jesus. It wants to help people like that who are tempted to abandon their Christian confession. Let go of it. They're not holding unswervingly to it. They're tempted to let go. Let their fingers loosen up from their grasp on Jesus. Because they had doubts about Jesus that were exacerbated by suffering. That's the problem that Hebrews solves. All right. What about the solution? That's the problem that Hebrews solves. that mouthful that we just went through. Okay, what about the solution? That's what that says. That's a you, everybody, okay? I'm a lefty, so cut me some slack. All right. You guys with me? We are, and I know it's late. Stick with me. We got to lay groundwork. So tomorrow when we jump into the text, you're going to be ready, okay? So stick with me. Stay in the notes. Let's look at the solution. What solution does this author offer? It's right there in your notes, and it's a mouthful, okay? There will not be a quiz where you'll have to reproduce this. Or maybe there should be, and I can give you Bethlehem merchandise if you can say it. All right, somebody stand up and say that line. If you can do that, maybe I will. All right. So here's the solution. Look, I just did that again. Come on. Stop. All right. Here's the solution. An anonymous pastor closely associated with the congregation responds with a word of exhortation focused on Jesus, specifically on the fittingness and necessity of his sacrifice for solving humanity's problem. And he structures his response into 2 stories plus application. That's like a Pauline sentence right there. That could have been Ephesians 1:3-14. Okay? I'll break it down. You don't have to remember it now, okay? Let me just talk about each of those parts and then we'll be done for tonight, okay? So first, an anonymous pastor. I'm going to disappoint you. If you came hoping I'd tell you who the author of Hebrews was, how many of you were hoping? All right, put your hands down. Big surprise, I don't know. I'm going to be just as curious in the new creation as you are to figure that out. That's like my 10th question on my list of Bible questions. Where's Paul? Okay, Paul. All right, there we go. So, I couldn't pick out the author of Hebrews in a lineup, but I can eliminate some of the usual suspects. All right, come on. That's not bad. It's not a home run, but at least I'm narrowing the field. So here's my first one I'm going to eliminate, because you're all thinking it. It wasn't Priscilla, right? That's what you're thinking. All right. And that's not because it would be contradicted by complementarity. It wasn't Priscilla. Let me just kind of point this out. There's a guy, 19th, 20th century German theologian and church historian called Adolf von Harnack. You know this guy? Probably not personally, but you've heard of him. And a lot of people since have argued that Priscilla is the author of the letter to Hebrews. There's not a ton of evidence for it, but some of it is her interaction with Apollos in Acts 18, where she helps Apollos sort of come to a full understanding of the gospel. I say all this to say the author of Hebrews can't be a woman. It has to be a man, not based on theology, but the author refers to himself as a man in Hebrews 11:32. Did you know this? You see if you can find this. Follow with me. Hebrews 11:32. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell. There it is. There's the masculine referent. Do you see it? Diegumenon. Come on, Greek scholars. You guys think Greek at this time of day, you're crazy. Guys, I had to teach a Greek exegesis class. Listen to this. They had me at 8:30 to 10 at night on Mondays. Seriously, I could have juggled fire. So, I'm not saying anything about this audience tonight, okay? Hebrews 11:32, right there in that word, diegumenon, which is a participle. This is as technical as we'll get. It's a masculine participle. I'm just telling you, the author refers to himself as a guy, so we'll call him he. I will often call the author of Hebrews, Hebrews. If that doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me. I'll just call him Hebrews. So there's a participle there in Hebrews 11:32 that's masculine. And some people say, well, it was a woman who was writing pseudonymously. You know what that means? She was giving herself the appearance of being a male, but so much of the letter's kind of power owes to the fact that the audience knows the author. And that the author knows the audience. So what would he be? Who's he faking for? Okay? So it's a dude. There you go. Second, it's not Priscilla, nor is it, and this is where some of you are going to throw your fountain pens at me, it's not Paul. Okay? I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, but it's not Paul. Why do I say that? Well, I can't harmonize what Paul says about himself in Galatians 1 with what Hebrews says about himself in Hebrews 2. Let me show you. Look at Galatians 1. Paul is adamant. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man. Which is to say, Paul, were you taught the gospel by the apostles? What would Paul have said? Come on, that's a little lackluster. What would he have said? Say it like Paul would say it. There you go. No, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Paul's pretty clear. I received the gospel in a vision on the road to Damascus from the Lord Jesus himself. Now, compare that with Hebrews 2:3. How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord through his death, burial, and resurrection, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. What do you hear here? It was announced by the Lord in his death, burial, and resurrection, and that message was confirmed, passed on, confirmed to us by who? By the apostles, by those who heard him, by the eyewitnesses. The author and his audience had received the gospel, not from Jesus Christ like Paul did, not from the Lord himself, but by those who heard the Lord. So I don't think it can be Paul. I think that would counteract what he says in Galatians 1, 11, and 12. And I think it's interesting here, just catch this, the author's attention to confirmation. I think this suggests once more the kind of letter we've already said it is. He's trying to prove something to his audience. This gospel was confirmed to us when you heard it. Remember how Paul does this in Galatians 3? He says, how did you receive the Spirit? Was it by works of the law or was it by faith? Remember this? And he expects they'll remember their experience of receiving the Spirit and they'll say, you're right, Paul. That wasn't by works of the law. That was by faith. Here again, he's saying, you remember when you heard the gospel. It was confirmed to you by the eyewitnesses. They told you what they saw. And then verse 4 of Hebrews 2, you also had signs of the Holy Spirit. There's an emphasis here on the gospel sort of, it was evidence. There was evidence provided that it was true. Okay. So it's not Priscilla. It's not Paul. Who is it? Anybody have any idea who it is? Anybody who you want it to be? Luke. All right, we got a Luke. Anybody else like Luke? There's a guy at Southwestern Seminary whose career it's Luke. I just think it's an unfalsifiable thesis. How do you prove it was or wasn't Luke? I don't know. Here's what I want to say. Don't miss this. There were Christians, I think this is pretty incredible. There were Christians in the first century who listened closely enough to the eyewitnesses that they were able to produce books like Hebrews. Isn't that amazing? They didn't see Jesus, they didn't walk with Jesus, they weren't one of the 12, but they listened closely enough to the eyewitnesses that they could produce something of the caliber of Hebrews. And for pastors, I think you should take some encouragement from that. Full-orbed discipleship is possible. Don't you ever wonder if it is? Seriously? I can actually pass the tradition on to another generation. Hebrews says, you better believe it. You can pass it on, plus. They can carry it on with even new insights. That's kind of encouraging, I think. All right, so an anonymous pastor. That's our first step. But one, as we've noted, who was closely associated with the congregation. I'll be quick with this. Look at Hebrews 13:19. He's away from his congregation. Notice what he says in Hebrews 13:19. He knows them. He says, I particularly urge you to pray that I may be restored to you soon. He's been there before. He wants to go back. He's closely associated with the congregation. He was away for some reason. I wish we knew. I don't know. Why did he go? But he's away. He knows this congregation. If we were to read through Hebrews, this is like on every page of Hebrews. Hebrews, the author knows this congregation. He knows what they are doubting. He knows where their suffering is acute. He has shared memories with them. Hey, remember when we heard the gospel? Remember when you were previously in suffering? He shares all of this life experience with this community. He knows them. He was closely associated with them. This was his, as far as I understand, this was his congregation. Though anonymous to us, he was not anonymous to them. What's more, let's move on. This anonymous author, closely associated with the congregation, responds with a word of exhortation. In fact, that's exactly how he describes his letter. Look at Hebrews 13:22. It's in your notes. It's a fitting description of his letter in light of the problem that we identified earlier. He wants to exhort his congregation. He wants to pastorally admonish them. So he says, Hebrews 13:22, brothers and sisters, I urge you to bear with, how does he describe his letter? My word of exhortation. And like every pastor, he says, for in fact, I've written to you quite briefly. We all think, our sermon, it's just a short sermon. What are you guys falling asleep for? It's a brief letter, but it's a letter full of exhortation. And this reminds us about something that's unique to the letter of Hebrews. You've noticed this when you've read it. Hebrews is unlike Paul, not just because Galatians 1, 11, and 12 can't be harmonized with Hebrews 2, 1 through 4. But unlike Paul, Hebrews doesn't give doctrinal information and then move to exhortation, does it? What does Hebrews do? He preaches a little bit, and then he applies. Then he preaches some more, and then he applies, and then he preaches some more, and then he applies. We've got exposition, scriptural arguments, then exhortation. Okay, then a little bit of more exposition, then exhortation, then exposition, then exhortation. It's kind of how, if you were here for my sermon this morning, that's how I did it. He doesn't save it all for the end, but he moves back and forth between these two genres. Exposition, scriptural argument, followed by exhortation, which can make outlining Hebrews a nightmare. Right? How many of you have had trouble outlining Hebrews before? Okay, I'm about to solve all your problems. No, I'm not, but some of them I hope. So he moves back and forth between these two genres. And the divisions between these two genres, you know what I mean by genres? Types of literature, types of communication. The division between the expositions and the exhortations are pretty easy to discern. It's the difference between scriptural argument and admonition. From Jesus is to you must. Did you hear the difference there? From indicative, Jesus is, to imperative, you must, or hortatory subjunctive, let us. We've got a difference in mood. We've got a difference in person, third person, Jesus is, second person, you must, or first person, we must. They're pretty easy to discern. In fact, I put a little note there in your notes about some other really interesting distinction between how the author of Hebrews even uses the Old Testament in these different genres. But that was one of the things that had to stay on the floor of my office. I can't bring that in. I don't have time for that. So, the expositions are the author's answer to the audience's doubt. Don't miss that. He's solving their problems in the expositions. That's what he's doing. And then the exhortations, they come along and they say, community, hold on to what I just said. I just helped you. I just answered a doubt. Now hold on to that truth. Don't let go of it. He pastorally applies it. In other words, his expositions ground his exhortation. Scriptural truth grounds pastoral application. Expositions, his theological arguments ground them. And this is evident even in the structure of Hebrews. So put your eyes on that table. Notice he does an exposition. What follows the exposition? It's in that table. Just say it. Okay. And then what follows? And then what follows? And then? All right, you get it. You get it. He gives an exposition and then he has an exhortation. Truth, funding, pastoral application. And then he says, okay, let's move on to another step of the argument. Truth, followed by pastoral admonition, application. So we see it there in the outline of Hebrews. So to rehearse, what's Hebrews' solution? What is Hebrews doing? Well, so far we've said it's an anonymous pastor, closely associated with the congregation, and he responds with a word of exhortation. But that's not all. Two more steps. It's a word of exhortation focused. This is a point I think maybe most of us have missed in Hebrews. How's that to kind of pique your interest? It's a word of exhortation focused on Jesus, but specifically, this is, I think, the specific aim of Hebrews. A word of exhortation focused on Jesus, specifically on the fittingness and necessity of his self-sacrifice for solving humanity's problem. You hear what I'm saying? Hebrews, I think, the doubts that he's directly responding to are doubts about Jesus being a suffering Messiah. And he's arguing in his letter that Jesus' death isn't a defeater to the Christian claim that Jesus is the Messiah, but his death was rather fitting and necessary. Let me show you this in a couple of places. Tomorrow we're going to geek out on this a little bit. Look at this. Focus on Jesus. This is from the first two verses of Hebrews. Notice it. It's the prologue where Hebrews introduces itself. Unusually, it doesn't say to the Hebrews, to those who are in Christ Jesus, from, you wish it said that, right? From Luke, or who knows. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Hebrews is focused on Jesus. That's why if you go on Amazon and I was going to say Google, what do you do in search bar Amazon? Google's, that's mixing categories. If you were to search Bible studies on Hebrews on Amazon, you know what they'd all be titled? Jesus is better. They're all titled that. I found 9 of them when I looked the other day. Jesus is better. The letter is about Jesus, but I would suggest to you it's not really about Jesus' betterness. Don't throw stuff at me yet. It's not just about his superiority. No, I think the author's sermon is focused on something much more specific. It's focused on the fittingness and necessity of Jesus' self-sacrifice for solving humanity's problem. Look with me at the Thesis of Hebrews. It's Hebrews 1:3b. Right at the end of the prologue, I think the author introduces the thesis, the theme of his letter. Here it is, Hebrews 1:3b. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He introduces the heart of the issue right at the beginning of his letter. Purification for sins, and then he sits down. Then he is installed as the Messiah. Okay? Now it's also found, look at Hebrews 2:10. We'll see tomorrow that this is at a strategic location in the letter of Hebrews. The author says, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, notice these words, it was fitting that God should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. I'm making a case here that Hebrews isn't just about Jesus, but it's about something very specific. It's proving the fittingness of Jesus as a suffering and then exalted Messiah. Look again at 2:17. For this reason, he had to be made like them. Now notice the rest of the bold, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. There was a necessity to Jesus' death. There was a fittingness to Jesus' death. Notice again, one more verse. Look at verse 9, verse 23, chapter 9, 23. It was necessary for the heavenly things themselves to be cleansed with better sacrifices. It doesn't say cleansed with. I left those words out. They should be in. It was necessary. Notice that word. Necessary. What was necessary? Cleansing. Not just cleansing, but cleansing with better sacrifices. Why is the author so insistent? Why is he so insistent on the fittingness and necessity of Jesus' death? Because I'm telling you, I think that was at the heart of the community's problem. All right, finally. The anonymous pastor's word of exhortation about Jesus, and specifically about the fittingness and necessity of his death, is structured, organized into 2 stories plus application. Let me see if I can help a little bit here at the end with Hebrews structure. It's organized into 2 stories and application. These are the 2 main moves of Hebrews. There's a story, there's another story, and then there's an application. Story 1, story 2, application. So let me see if I can show this to us. One way that an ancient author, I'm not sure you can see that. I'll switch to black next time. If I was in my classroom, I'd chuck it against the wall just to wake people up. Doosh! Then it explodes. The other day, I pulled up one of those white screens and then let it go and turned around to teach. And it was like, chuk, chuk, boom, and just fell on the ground. It kind of startled me. Students were laughing. So I don't have anything like that in here that I could destroy. So we'd have to take another offering, I guess. One way that ancient authors would structure their documents, and you know this, structure reveals emphasis, doesn't it? What's the point of finding an outline of Hebrews? You're trying to see what was the author trying to say. What is he emphasizing? What are his main points? One way that an ancient author would structure his material, would outline it, he didn't have access to numbers like we use in Microsoft Word, or bold font, or color coding. Maybe he did, but it was really expensive. What they would do is they would create these things called inclusios, brackets. I like to call them sandwiches, where you say something and then you talk for a little while and you say that first thing almost in identical words. And you bracket a section. And you know what that bracket suggests? It says everything in between, I want you to read it as one unit. That's one of my main points. And everything that came before, don't confuse it with this stuff. Everything that comes after, it's not part of this. That's what a bracket does. Everything between the top piece of bread and the bottom piece of bread, the sandwich, is meant to be eaten together. And an author would structure his argument like this. Well, did you know the main structuring clue that we find in Hebrews is a bracket of almost 2 identical statements? We've already talked about these a little bit. They're in your notes and they're color-coded. Hebrews didn't do that. Microsoft Word did that. They're color-coded. It's text right before Hebrews 5:1, 5:1, and right after Hebrews 10:18. There's a bracket right there. Bracket. We'll say sandwich. Okay? Oops. Sandwich. Right before 5:1 and right after 10:18. As you look at it, you should see there are 9 similar elements in these 2 texts. In the Greek, there's shared vocabulary. I'm not making this up. The author deliberately repeats himself around this center section of Hebrews. And what he's saying is, I want you to read all of this together. I'm bracketing it. This is all kind of looks like a sandwich now that I drew it. It's like a hoagie, okay? I want you to read all of this together. So, how do we get from that to 2 stories plus an application? Remember, I've told you that's what the author of Hebrews, that's his outline. How do I get there? Well, this bracket tells us one very important thing. It says this is one of the author's points. Everything that comes before, that's point 1. Right here is point 2. Everything that comes after is point 3. So we've got 3 sections to Hebrews. If you want a clue to Hebrew structure, this bracket, this inclusio, this sandwich, is the most important clue in Hebrews. There are so many elements that are repeated, and it's telling you, read this section as one section, 5 to 10:18. Read everything that comes before it as in one section, and read everything that comes after it as one section. 3 moves in Hebrews. Is there anything more we can say about his outline? Yes. Remember this. Look at your notes. Stick with me. This is the last thing we'll do today, okay? Stick with me. Lock in. 3 parts to Hebrews. What else can we say about his outline? Well, remember the 2 genres that we've already noticed. What are they? There's the exposition and, okay, these help with the outline as well. Notice, the exposition is different from the exhortation. The exposition is different from the exhortation. So in that first section of Hebrews, Hebrews 1:1 through 4:16, through that piece of bread there that we saw at the top, that first section is further divided by genre. We've got scriptural argument followed by pastoral admonition, followed by scriptural argument, and then pastoral admonition. So already we're seeing, okay, I got 3 points, and within the points there are moves from exposition to exhortation back to exposition. So we're saying, all right, how do I get to the author's outline? And this is how we do it. We look at the bracket, and then we look at the genres. So how many expositions are there in Hebrews' first section? Look at your notes. How many expositions? 2. Okay. How many expositions in his second section? 2. Okay. How many in the third? None. Okay, the third is just exhortation. There. That's why I say the third section is just application. What else can we say? We can take one step further. We've looked at the bracket. We've looked at genre. All right, here's a simple one. What's one of the clearest ways to tell when an author changes subjects? When he changes subjects. Okay, I know. I got a PhD, you don't, so it's okay. I'm being facetious. It doesn't take a PhD to see this. Well, you know he's talking about something else when he moves on to another topic. When he moves on to another point. So walk with me through this final table. And what I want to show to you is that the 2 expositions of Hebrews' first point are actually 3 expositions. The first exposition, notice what I have for a description of its content. What do you see? Say it, please. 7 Old Testament citations. And then you've got an exhortation. And then I've got exposition 2. This used to be 1 exposition, but now I've divided into 2. Why? Because in 2:5-9, he's talking about reflecting on one Bible passage. He's reflecting on Psalm 8. But then he changes subjects in 2:10-18, and he starts talking about the fittingness of Jesus' death. So do you see? We went from looking at 3 sections, then looking at the changes of genre, and now I'm telling you, you're able to distinguish between his expositional moves by paying attention to the subject that he's talking about. So in the first part of Hebrews, now we have 3 expositional sections. Same for, look at 5:1 to 10:18. This used to be just 2 expositions. Notice we still have the exposition in 5:1 to 10, followed by an exhortation. But then notice that long expositional section from 7:1 through 10:18 has now become 6 different expositions, each of them discussing, analyzing, commenting on a different Old Testament text. So exposition 5, the author is saying, I want you to look at Genesis 14. Exposition 6, he says, look with me at Psalm 110, verse 4. Exposition 7, look at Jeremiah 31. Exposition 9, he says, let's look at the Day of Atonement. Or exposition 8. Exposition 9, he says, all right, back to Psalm 110. Then exposition 10, he kind of ends with a bang. He says, look at these 4 texts. Here's what I'm telling you. This is an easy way for us to follow the author's outline. I've bracketed for you this whole center section, he says. Think of that as one unit. I've also given you clues, my genre distinctions. Follow those. Don't group those all together. I'm doing something different in those. And don't miss, in my expositions, sometimes I'm talking about one text, and then I'll talk about another. Pay attention to that change. This is how we get our 2 stories. The first story of Hebrews is told in 1:1 through 4:16, and it's told in those 3 expositional sections. You say, why is tomorrow called story 1 and then story 2? That's why. In the first part of Hebrews, we've got 3 expositional sections, and he says, all right, I'm going to tell you the story, the gospel, in one way. And then he says, in this middle section, in those 7 expositions, he says, I'm going to tell that same story again. Yes, there's exhortations mixed in, but the author's theological message is carried by those expositions in each of these sections. So 2 stories, story 1, story 2, followed by a long, extended, and memorable exhortation. Down here is where we have the hall of faith of Hebrews. And we've got all kinds of other things. We've got to talk about Esau, and we've got to talk about how God disciplines his children, and so forth. All right, well done. Let me summarize. So why was Hebrews written? What's the problem? Hebrews intends to help Christians tempted to abandon their Christian confession because of doubts about Jesus. And those doubts, we've suggested, were exacerbated by suffering. How does Hebrews help? How does it solve this problem? Answer was this. In Hebrews, an anonymous pastor, we don't know who it is, but he was closely associated with the congregation. He responds with a word that he characterizes as a word of exhortation. And this word of exhortation, this stuff is focused on Jesus. And it's focused, I'm making an argument, it's focused specifically on the fittingness and necessity of Messiah's self-sacrifice for solving the human problem. And that fitting answer is told in story 1 and story 2, followed by application. Okay? All right. Here's what I'd like you to do. Besides go home and get a good night's rest, we got a lot of ground to cover. Here's what I'd like you to do. Would you do me a favor? Find the outline in your notes one more time. If you would, in your 45-minute time in the Word tomorrow, with your cup of coffee or your tea, if that's how you like to read your Bible, read the 10 expositions of Hebrews. There's 10. They're not very long, and that would set us up well to walk through each of them tomorrow in our 2 sections. Simply read through them. Get familiar with them, so that as I'm talking tomorrow, this is a book that you have, maybe some of you say, I'm already familiar with this, great. But if Hebrews feels a little bit distant, Why don't you get familiar with it in the next 12 hours? That sounds about right, okay? So would you do that and then come back tomorrow and we'll be ready to walk through what we've got. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you.